Welcome to the Common Time Podcast, a show designed to give music educators practical, inspiring ideas for you and your program. Each week, we sit down with world-class educators, composers, and conductors to talk about teaching, leadership, and building programs that thrive without burning yourself out.
So whether you're a band, orchestra, or choir director, our goal is simple: to help you grow and stay inspired and remember why you fell in love with teaching music in the first place.
This is season 4, and we're diving even deeper. More real conversations, more actionable takeaways, and more voices shaping the future of music education. Let's get into the episode. Our guest today is Sam Quinones. Welcome, Sam.
Oh, great to be with you guys on Common Time. It's wonderful to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much. We are so excited that you're here. And I want to tell our listeners a little bit about you, since we typically have on more music education type guests. Sam is one of the most respected narrative journalists writing about American life today. And his previous books, most previous is Dreamland, which is about the opioid epidemic. And I believe that became a bestseller, helped shape the national conversation around addiction in the United States. Yes. Sam has testified before Congress. He's appeared on major news outlets. He's really built a reputation for deeply reporting these stories about, really stories that have we've seen shape communities across America. So it's probably a surprise for our listeners that his newest book is about the tuba. And we're going to talk about that today. The title of the book is The Perfect Tuba. And there's a lot of great stories in there, but there's a big message that he's sending out to the world as well. So, Sam, we're glad to have you. John, why don't you get us started?
Thanks, David. Hi, Sam. It's an honor to have you here. I'm a tuba player, so this one really hits home for me specifically also. But all right, so I'm just going to get started. So throughout your career, you've spent some time writing about some of the darkest issues in American life, including addiction and social breakdown. So it could surprise people that your latest book is about the tuba. So how did this story find you?
Well, it's about the tuba. It's also about band directors, because I find them to be kindred spirits, and both kind of, as the book took shape, it became clear to me that the ways in which they were similar, band directors and tuba players, was very important. But basically, I'm a crime reporter. I've been a crime reporter. I've been a reporter 39 years, and most of that I've done crime. Covered hundreds of homicides and drug addiction, and a lot on gangs and etc. Years ago, I lived in Mexico for 10 years, and then I came up and took a job at the LA Times. And at the LA Times, at one point, I wrote a story about how the tuba was this enormously important instrument in the Mexican immigrant community in Los Angeles, particularly through banda music. But also because a lot of social life in the Mexican immigrant community took place in backyard parties, and people would hire their own bands. And having a tuba, glorious, enormous, golden thing, a sousaphone, really, right? But they don't call it a sousaphone; it's just a tuba. To them, it was kind of almost. First of all, it was this powerful force at a party, but also was a sign of an immigrant having arrived economically, and so they became enormously important. Everybody, all these trumpet players and trombone players switched to tuba because they're getting paid triple. And then I published that. So I published that story in the front page of the LA Times, 2011, I think it must have been. The next day, a band director called me from one of the predominantly Mexican high schools in the area and says, "Yeah, the wonderful story. That's absolutely true what you wrote. Did you know that we've had all our tubas being stolen and over the last few months?" And I said, "No, I had no idea." And so I wrote another story, follow up to that, about how these tubas were being stolen from these high schools, predominantly Mexican high schools, mostly because of the popularity of the instrument. And then something hit me. First of all, I do not play the tuba. I have never played a brass instrument or wind instrument. I was never in band, but I began to understand. I began to see this is a subculture, a world I know nothing about. And I've always wanted to dig into worlds I know nothing about. As a journalist, it seems to me very, very important to do that. And so I began interviewing tuba players of all kinds, not just Mexicans, all across the country. And as very early on, I began to realize that people were playing the tuba because they loved it, because it, for a lot of guys, mostly guys, it showed them what they could be. It showed them their capabilities, and this was a powerful force in their lives. It showed them that if they kept at it, they would get good at it, and then all of a sudden, it just kind of transformative in their lives. And I was not expecting that. You know, I was expecting, I like it, it's cool. No, this is something that people who, without any expectation of wealth or fame or notoriety of any kind, playing the tuba and, you know, really focusing on like playing 8 measures of an etude just perfectly before you go on to the next 8, you know, that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah.
It was just, and you know, as a journalist, by then I had really understood one thing, and that is if you find people who are doing something with for the great love they have for that activity, and you stick with them, you're going to find great stories someday. And I just kept on interviewing people as I wrote. I actually wrote 2 books about drug addiction and drug trafficking in America. One was about the opioid epidemic. Then the next one was about fentanyl and methamphetamine. And through all that, I would just do these interviews with these tuba players. And then, until the last book was finished, and my agent said, maybe you should see what kind of book you could write about the tuba. And that's kind of what began all
you
this.
are.
I love
That's a wonderful story. You mentioned that you don't play an instrument. And so to me, that was especially interesting as I was reading through this book, because the book itself it's kind of a history lesson as well. There's a lot of things I learned that I didn't even know about the book. I didn't know anything about the York tubas, those kinds of things. So you come into this somewhat as an outsider. We're the insiders, the music educators. So I'm curious, since you didn't grow up in band or playing the tuba, did you notice, or was there something you noticed about this culture that we on the inside probably or may take for granted?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that within the stories I was telling, first of tuba players, and then adding onto that of band directors, principally down in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, I began to see that what you would learn, regardless of whether in the long run you became a professional tuba player, what you would learn were amazing skills that allowed you to do well in life, right? So focus in a time of horrible distraction, provoked by algorithms on social media and all the rest, right? We have a group of people whose main idea in life is focus. Again, playing those 8 measures of that etude just right.
Yeah.
You know, and postpone gratification. I began to see that this was all about that. Even when you played it really, really well, first of all, the applause was, nice, but not overwhelming. And nevertheless, you came to kind of see that through this, the tuba player learned how to navigate life in a more healthy way than corporate American capitalism is teaching us with those algorithms on social media and all the rest. I thought too, very important in all this, and really clearly in opposition to all that I had written about in my drug books and my crime books, was collaboration with others, even people you don't really particularly like all the time. You are collaborating, and we are so isolated, and our isolation in America seems to me to be a major root of our drug addiction epidemic. And so all of this I began, and this was not immediate. It took a while. It took a while interviewing lots of people, and especially setting down to write their stories. One thing to interview someone, it's another thing to set out to write that person's story, because then you have to usually interview that person over and over, and you get very deep into that story. And that's where you find, through telling those stories that are in the book, that's where you come to these ideas like, oh my goodness. And again, it's about immersion. And what is a band director or a tuba player about, if not just complete immersion in making this sound as proud and as solid as possible?
Yeah. All right. Absolutely.
So then, Sam, of all the people that you've met throughout your research of the book, including tuba players, teachers, band directors, is there a single moment or story that stayed with you the most?
Oh, it's a great question. It's a little bit like asking me which was my favorite child,
Yeah.
Yeah, it's probably true.
but oh, oh man, there are so many. The story of Jared Trevino, the one of the probably the best tuba player in the Rio Grande Valley in his time. His story was very powerful because he came to the tuba as almost a balm of against the horrible bullying that he was experiencing throughout his life, and and came to it. A lot of times uh, people come to musical instruments because their parents tell them to, and I totally believe in that. My daughter plays the piano now because I insisted that she play the piano, even when she didn't want to. But J.R. Trevino never came to the tuba because he had to. He always embraced it fully and loved it and began to almost have a communion with it, and got very, very good because he did not go to it kicking and screaming. You know,
Right.
I also have to say that again, the band directors, I began to include the band directors in a book about the tuba players because they seemed, as I said, almost kindred spirits. What are you doing as a band director? You're putting in unbelievable hours, probably the most overworked profession in America. As
We would
band
attest to
director.
that.
I mean,
Agreed.
yes, no,
Yeah.
it's nuts. It's nuts. It's not healthy. School districts really need to reduce the amount of hours a lot of these directors have to put in. But you're putting in all these hours, and you're again focus, postpone gratification, perseverance through failure. It's another thing that kids in band and tuba players really really learn early on, and it's so helpful in the rest of your life. And none of this really without any, as I said, expectation of notoriety or fame or world fortune or any of that kind of stuff. Rather, as Al Cortines, who remains kind of my guy, in just a brilliant man, I think, and very big-hearted, who set up this system in the little town of Roma, Texas, that turned a whole group, years and years worth of kids who had no access to music lessons into really top flight bands in Texas. He said, I talked to him. He's not retired, and I said he's still kind of part-time teaching here and there. And he said, I still love to see the lights go on in the eyes of my kids. And I thought that is exactly how certain tuba players had felt after they had practiced and practiced and practiced and gotten this performance just down, and then to play it one time really well, it just, that feeling didn't leave them, and they learned so much from that. And to me, I got very, very carried away. I'm a crime reporter. I'm supposed to be all cynical and crusty and all. But, I really, really love optimistic people. And tuba players and band directors are, up to this point, some of the most optimistic people I've met.
Yeah. The book itself, so we're both from Texas. We're both music educators, band directors.
Yeah.
And I was growing up, I remember the Lopez High School band, the honor band recordings from when I was in college, my undergraduate. And then my first teaching job was in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I remember well when they won honor band, because it was a huge deal to hear that group perform at TMEA. And I was in the audience for that. Like, it was a pretty mind-blowing accomplishment.
You were there?
I was there.
You were there in San Antonio in that big theater.
I was. Lala Cockrell.
Oh my goodness.
So
that's amazing.
I'm telling you, reading this book, there's parts of this book that I teared up at, like literally the stories of success in seeing these kids that have come from, a very different world than the Dallas, Austin, Houston area, and those, very wealthy, districts. So the expectation, but it was also really refreshing too, to see, really those directors created their own system, which is connected to Vandercook. John and I actually, we do a course at Vandercook every other year or so, and on a book that we wrote. So it's there's a lot of connections in this book for band teachers, especially if you're from Texas. Like some of it was memory lane for me. Some of it was kind of reinforcing why we do this thing. But there was another part that was really interesting to me and kind of surprising because I knew nothing. I'm not a tuba player. I'm a trumpet player, but I knew nothing about the perfect tuba idea, the York tubas. I knew nothing about it. So learning about that, and obviously the title of the book is that. I'm just curious in terms of, you had to learn a lot. Like from a non-music standpoint, like you describe things in here musically that I'm like, man, he really did his study. Like you talk about Symphony, Persichetti 6, that symphony, which is what Lopez played at Lila Cockrell in that performance. Like, but then you start talking about Persichetti's music, and like, man, this author did a lot of research to come up with all of the information in here.
That's the beauty of journalism. It is if you love exploring, which I do, if you love gathering stories, and then once you have a story that you think might be good, you do not, it's like a gold, you got this gold mine, you do not let it go. You keep on interviewing everybody who might have anything to do with it. So for the Lopez High story, so I'm just so touched that you were in the audience that night.
Right.
I can tell you, when I heard the Lopez High story, George Trevino, and all those, there's not a lot of kids, so like 30 people in that band. It was not a large band by any means. And how these kids who didn't have any access to music lessons at all created this sound that had the audience giving them a standing ovation midway through the concert, not even at the end, and that people would then years later still remember this. I'm getting chills right now. I'm telling you. But see, as a journalist, first of all, a main motto of any journalist, certainly this one, is find stories don't write about what you know. Write about what you don't know, and you're gonna find out all about it. And that was the tuba book, the band, the Perfect Tuba for sure. And especially then, some of these band director stories, just like my wife started crying reading them, and I began to understand that this was not a book, as sometimes has been reported in certain reviews. This is not a zany romp through the history of the tuba. This is not. It's more about how we find fulfillment in a world where we're being told constantly fulfillment comes from immediate gratification and distraction and all the rest. No, I've written too much about that as a drug reporter, and I can tell you none of that works. It's the thing about this book was, it was an attempt to say, we know what leads to fulfillment. It's hard work. It's perseverance. It's focus. It's all those things that you learn playing the tuba. It's all those things that you learn in bands. So many kids in America learn these precious, precious things, and we ignore them. We ignore that. We applaud the athletes on the field, but the kids who are really learning the good stuff are up in the bleachers playing for them. You know what I mean? Right. And so, no, that story, I found the Lopez High Symphony No. 6 story late in the manuscript, and I made an extra trip down to Brownsville to talk to kids who they're now adults, who had been in the band when that band played that concert, which was in February of 2004 at the TMEA conference there. And I was in my glory. I felt like, oh my God, it's been so hard to figure all this story out. But here I found this beautiful, beautiful story. Do not miss any kid that you can find, adult now, who can tell you something about what it was like being on stage and all the work that went into it.
Right.
And it was that was such a beautiful, one of the great stories I think I've ever told in my life. And it was about a small band. I never played in a band, in a school band and stuff, but it was so beautiful. Anyway, I get carried away with this stuff because it's so good. Very, very healthy thing.
Yeah. Well, and the story, there are so many good stories. That's not the only one. There's several in there. There's, in Roma and that marching, going to the state marching contest. Like I've had bands perform at state marching contests. That is hard work. There is a process to get there. But the title of the book is The Perfect Tuba. So
yes, I'm sorry, I forgot to answer your question.
No, it's all right. I want to draw us back over there for a second, because those instruments, the York tubas, I read about this in the book. I didn't know anything about them. I'm guessing our listeners, some of them will, some tuba players will, but I had never known. So I'm curious, can you tell us a little bit about what makes those instruments so legendary, and then kind of how you use that to really create the whole?
Well, first,
operation.
It's important to understand that I have been a reporter for a long, long time, and I'm not. I've never written anything about music education. I do play the guitar. My mother, my mother, when we were growing up, said every one of her boys was going to play a musical instrument, and so we all did, and it was fun and all. But I would say that really, it's in journalism that I've found myself, and I now have I can say this with confidence, I have now a very, very finely tuned journalistic radar that goes bonkers when I hear a great story. Okay. And so as I was interviewing all these tuba players, one guy I talked to was Bob Carpenter, who is a tuba player for the Orlando Symphony, also a NASA engineer, rocket scientist, yes. And he told me, have you ever heard of the Chicago Yorks? I'm like, no, I don't know what you're talking about. Okay. And then he proceeded to tell me the story of these two tubas that are renowned, mystical tubas in the tuba world. Like every tuba player looks at these two tubas as like, the most perfect expression of their instrument, made in the 1930s by the York Musical Instrument Company, Grand Rapids, Michigan, a company that later, not long after that, went out of business. They made two prototypes of this one C tuba, and that's it. And that's all they ever made of this one prototype.
Yeah.
And it was eventually landed in the hands of the great Arnold Jacobs, who was the tuba player for, he got it before he became the tuba player for the Chicago Symphony. But this great musician and these two great tubas formed kind of the foundation for the Chicago Symphony's legendary brass sound.
Yeah.
But more than that, there's a very important thing that this story was about. And that was, at this very moment, talking about the 50s, 60s, 70s, tuba players were rebelling against the confines in which they've been held. The tuba can only do this. Therefore, you are not really a musician. You can do this, and that's it. There was this real like limitation on what people thought tuba could do. And a lot of tuba players kind of internalized all that, in the 70s, really, it began this feeling like, no, we need to break away from all that. We need to find our own expression as musicians, find our own virtuosity. And along the way, they needed, because of that, I think it's very natural that they needed superheroes. And Arnold Jacobs became a tuba superhero to all these young tuba players all across the country. And along with that, Arnold Jacobs gave many, many master classes, and he was very public and he talked all the time about these two tubas, that one guy says, it's an honor to be in the same room, and they're the perfect expression of tuba, right? And Arnold Jacobs talked about them constantly. And so you have this virtuoso musician and also one of the great music teachers of all time in the 20th century, and taught many brass instrument players as well as vocalists, as not just tuba. He becomes this purveyor of this idea, like, we can be great musicians. And by the way, it doesn't hurt to have two perfect tubas, in your closet like he had. And so there grew up around all this among tuba players searching for the liberation of their own creativity, to break the bonds that constrain them. This feeling like we have a superhero, we have two great horns, and it created this kind of almost a mania for York tubas. They had made many tubas, they just had never made these two more than this two of these prototypes. And they were really probably the greatest tuba manufacturer of their day, certainly in the United States. And so, anyway, it became this, and so nine companies, including Yamaha, have tried to replicate these two tubas over the last 30, 40 years. And really, they've come very close, but not really there. And so part of the story that Bob Carpenter was telling me was how he and another engineer in Orlando, Tom Treese, two fabulous guys, fascinating stories, each of them, had been comparing notes about how to replicate these two gorgeous, glorious, legendary, and mystical, the holy grail of tubas, is how it was described to me on a few occasions, tubas. And the story that I tell in the book is Bob and Tom's attempt to recreate those two perfect tubas. But along the way, it's again, part of this book became a wondrous antidote to all the addiction and the drugs and the drug trafficking I had once written about. It became, addiction is enslavement. It's obedience to a substance which will not allow you to do anything but use it. That's it. You don't have a relationship with anything or anybody else once you're addicted to fentanyl or heroin or whatever, right? And here was a story. These were stories about people wanting to liberate their own creativity, train their beautiful breath of the column of air coming up from their abdomen and so on. And it was just a beautiful idea that I was writing about people really not understanding this at first, who were trying to liberate their own creativity and find themselves in that. And I think that is one of the great, to me, was one of the great themes that I've ever written about, because it requires hard work, preparation, perseverance, all the collaboration, all of that. But in the end, it's how we as humans find fulfillment, find contentment. Unlike drugs, which gives you a very immediate blast of pleasure and then leaves you in the gutter. This is a way of developing, finding your own perfect tuba. And that's, so at the end, it became kind of like a metaphor for how do we as human beings find fulfillment. And at the very last part of the book, I say, parents come up to me and ask me how to keep, how to keep kids away from drugs. One of the things I tell them was, I'm not sure, but high school band seems to do a pretty good job. And the other thing is, don't get in the way of your kid working very, very hard to develop his or her own perfect tuba. That does not mean everyone should go out and play the tuba.
Right.
But all of us have within us something to which we will devote enormous amounts of work to get better at it, because we love it, and regardless of how much fame and wealth and all the rest that we're going to get from it.
Yeah. I fully support everybody listening should play the tuba. I fully support that. So Sam, the book profiles some remarkable band directors working through really tough circumstances. I mean, including economically depressed towns and underfunded schools. And, so in reporting these stories, what did you learn that's actually happening in these band rooms that America may not fully understand?
Yeah, this is a very good question. And I think one thing is that, and I think Al Cortina said it best real early on in his development of his band. Now, Al Cortinas came to Roma High School from another, which is in the Rio Grande Valley, one of the poorest parts of America, which is just the valley alongside the Mexico border with Texas. He had been a band director in another town, had developed there some ideas about how to make band much better given the economic realities. The economic realities were that families could barely afford instruments and certainly could not afford music lessons. So the teachers had to be there, the instructors had to be there also, their music teachers. And he found two in Roma, Texas. He found a superintendent and a school board president who really, really bought into his idea and provided the funding, cutting a lot of other things to provide the funding to hire a bunch of band directors. Each band director would have responsibility for one instrument: French horn, clarinet, tuba, trumpet, that kind of sax, whatever. And they would teach every kid in that instrument, all who happened to be from 6th to 12th grade in that school district. And so all day long, they would be going from school to school, elementary, middle school, high school, and then teaching marching in the evening. And in that way, he felt we could create kids who were who could compete with the wealthiest, predominantly white schools in Texas, meaning schools near out in the suburbs of Dallas, Austin, and Houston, and it took a while. But one of the key moments came early on, like the third year of this system, where his kids in sixth grade were now in ninth grade, and so the band was getting, and they were all learning fundamental. It was all about fundamentals, notes, playing, rest, playing together, and all this kind of thing, and and uh, and they were getting to a certain sound that was beginning to really excite the kids. They were amazed. They were like, "Oh God, we could make this." They had never learned that because band was like, they had no football team back then, and no one really cared about the band. And all of a sudden, this guy comes in, and all of a sudden puts these new standards, high standards. Doesn't tell anybody they're hard, but just says they're high. These are the standards, and the kids begin to meet it over a period of years. And he assigns for the band Carmina Burana, Carl Orff, this wonderful, very bass heavy, by the way, piece of poems chanted or sung by monks of the Middle Ages and so on. And all these kids were blown away when they heard it over the speakers, he told me. And he said, and they said, "Can we do that?" And he said, "Of course, we're going to do it." And they said, "Okay." He says, "This is the key thing. Kids will rise or fall to whatever standard you set, high standard, low standard. They'll meet that standard, whatever. Just don't tell them. If you set a high standard, don't tell them that it's hard." And this is such an important thing for our culture to hear. So often parents are so eager to prevent their kids from experiencing difficulty and disappointment and hard work. And my feeling is, man, band, that's all band is about, is learning to deal with that, because obviously through life, we're all going to deal with all of that.
Yep.
And still, I think very often kids in America just are taught, no, you should never feel that. Oh, no, hovering over the kid. No. In band, man, it's creating studs. It's saying, get out there and do it again when it's not right, and do it again the third time, fourth, whatever, 20th time. And I think, to me, that is, now it can be taken too far. I think I've heard of examples of like kind of insane, frankly, approaches to band that require people to be, this all they do. And I you can go from one end to the other very quickly if you want, but band done well and done with common sense requires so much of kids that they don't think they can do, but then they do it. And when you realize that as a young person, I mean, I can remember my own case and in other contexts thinking, oh my God, I could do this. And there is nothing more intoxicating than that. No drug could compete with that, And
absolutely.
so to me, this was one of the things that I felt was really going on in those band rooms, was saying, you're going to meet this. And I'm not going to, we're not even going to discuss how hard it is. I'm going to tell you that you'll be able to do it. And then when you do it, you'll realize I was right.
Yeah, this book is in a lot of ways, in terms of advocacy for music education, there's a lot of themes in here that I think people need to hear, because I think you're right. The band room does provide that community. And you just mentioned talking about those kids and their experiences. So for me, in reading the book, it made me think about how many students do find identity in a band room. And this is across the country.
100%.
So I'm kind of curious from your perspective, since you came into this as a non-music educator, if you will, did the book change how you think about music education?
I would say that no, because as I said, my mother was an elementary school teacher and she played piano and grew up in the church choir. We had music all along. And so I did not think that this was I still support music education in schools. And I think one of the great saving graces of America is that it has the most evolved, the widest, most expansive school music education programs in the world, probably the most, I would say. And so I guess what really struck me was, having come from writing about addiction and all the enslavement, the immediate gratification, and that people were casting about, like, how do we keep our kids? I mean, I can tell you, I gave many speeches over my previous 2 books about opioids and fentanyl and meth and all that kind of stuff. And frequently I would get, how do we keep kids away from our drugs? So many of them. And here I was in the middle of a world that I didn't know about at all, learning all about it, putting all of my effort and all my energies into trying to understand and interviewing constantly, sometimes repeatedly. Many people I interviewed in this book 8 or 10 times, just because I'm afraid of not getting something right, and looking like a fool. And through it all, I began to see that what they were teaching was kind of the answer
Right.
to how do you keep your kids away from dope,
Yeah.
and so I did not. That was, to me, a remarkable idea. Not that there are no kids who ever have any problems with drugs in band rooms, but I would say that the amount of that is so small. I just did an interview for my Substack. I have a newsletter called the Dreamland Newsletter. It's at samquinones.substack.com. And I'm going to put up an interview I did with a tuba player of a young kid, a very, very small town in West Virginia, where the opioid problem was really bad. And band was like a shell to protect them from all the stuff going on around them. And none of those kids got involved in drugs. All of the kids who were seniors in his year, all of them graduated. I find it absolutely delusional that any school superintendent faced with budget issues would cut band. I mean, that is like that's shooting yourself in both feet.
Yeah.
I have said this in public and written this and so on. It's such an important thing. And so to me, this is kind of what I realized, that there across America was this thing that was keeping us alive as a community, and it was band and all these kids learning instruments that were not easy and required a lot of work, and that their parents didn't stand in the way of their suffering, quote unquote, which is not suffering at all, but just hard work.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
This is such a fascinating story.
Yeah.
It makes me, I'm serious. I'm sorry to interrupt, but
Please.
there were times when I was like ready to cry.
Yeah.
Because I had written so much about the opposite. People, the fentanyl fold. I don't know if you know what the fentanyl fold is. People use fentanyl. They walk like this, at inverted L, or sometimes like this. I mean, it's grotesque. It's grotesque.
Yeah,
and so to see this, the opposite, there, we just have ignored it. Band and name it. Well, you guys can, but I mean, I frequently in public name a band director, name a tuba player. Nobody can. Why? Because we focus on the athletes, we focus on all the glitzy, sexy stuff, and instead we've got the answer right there, and we've ignored it.
So we just talked about this, but I do want to perhaps codify it just a bit more for the listeners. So during your reporting on addiction and social breakdown, you often write about communities that are coming apart, right?
Yes.
And in the book, you spend time with people who are building something together through the art of music. So did those experiences change the way you think about what holds a community together?
I don't think it did. I kind of had these ideas that it's about small steps. It's about, it's about finding your way forward through small steps. It's like all those kids in Roma, Texas, every year, they play a certain etude perfectly, then they move on to the next etude. I would say that I had this idea long before this, that the way we fight drug addiction is by focusing on strengthening, rebuilding, in many cases, community through the small steps. We so want magic answers to all our problems. The opioid epidemic was basically that. It was, what's the problem? Human pain. How do we deal with it? With one kind of drug for every single human being. All these opioid painkillers, Oxycontin, Vicodin, and all the rest. And man, we're still paying for that delusion. And really, it's about the way we human beings make progress. When we innovate and we make real social change, is small steps. It's not not coincidentally, it's the way you recover from drugs, one day at a time, that kind of thing. That idea is very, very potent. The problem is, in today's American corporate capitalism, we are inundated with the idea that no, you need it immediately. You can't do it. If it takes a long time, you're going to get bored, blah, 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 all that. And I think that is such a damaging message, I swear.
Yeah.
And so building community, it was like John Weber in Harvey, Illinois, who this white guy from North Chicago comes down to teach this predominantly black school south of there, and he had this system. He devised. These are kids again who could not afford music lessons. John Weber devised this system called checkoff, which means he would divide all of your music knowledge that you needed to have. He was junior high, so 7th and 8th. By 9th grade, you needed to know this. He would divide it up into small little pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And each one of those, when you did this etude or when you were playing this G scale or whatever, you would get a check and you make it very public. You put it up on the wall. Here, this guy has 5 checks. This girl, she has 9. What's going on? You need to get more. That kind of. So there was this competition, and little by little, the checkoff system was brilliant because it kept kids eager to improve, and it was not brutal. He did not. If you couldn't really do it, he would explain to you what you needed to do. But he would always leave you with a way forward. It was not saying, "Oh, you're a loser. You best leave." No, you're going to be able to do this. You're just not doing it yet. But here, I want you to do this, and he would give you the way forward. Small steps. And also, as a band director, one of the beautiful things that John Weber would do. Sadly, John died. Visited John several times at his house. He was long retired by then. He died before the book could come out. But what several of his students told me was that one of the things he also had was an enormous box that they remember as being CDs, basically. This was long ago. This was in which it was just filled with jazz, band music, classical music, and he would let them explore. And that's really, really important. Let them rummage through the box, right? Oh, I want to listen to this. I take this home, And so kids, the tuba players, one of them in particular, Willie Clark, I interviewed at great length, and it was a big part of the book. He brings home a Flight of the Bumblebee that John Phillips in England had played on the tuba, and that's, I'm going to do that, and so it's providing this place for kids to be themselves, and yet he was also a disciplinarian. He would get very upset when they would like mess up or screw off, that kind of thing. And so there was this combination of love and discipline and hard work and fun, all of that together. And also understanding that the checkoff system was the key because you were making these small steps, and it was the small steps that building on one another, on one building on the next, on the previous one. And that was how it was going to be. You were going to get kids to really click in. And many of those kids never went into music. But my impression is that many of them are doing marvelously well in life because of the things that they learned in doing the checkoff system and in John Weber's junior high school band in Harvey, Illinois.
Yeah, right. I in reading the book, it's The Perfect Tuba. This is the title, and it doesn't really talk about addiction, but I remember in the beginning, you do set us up and give us some background. And at one point, you contrast addiction, which is really about chasing instant gratification, which you've just mentioned. But you contrast that with the discipline of learning an instrument, specifically the tuba here. And I remember you set it up as a mirror of one of the other. What did you mean by that?
Well, by then I had studied addiction, and particularly opioid addiction. And opioid addiction, these are addiction to drugs like heroin, morphine, various drugs that come from the opium poppy. And these drugs have one thing in common. It's a long story about why this is, but to overdose on these drugs, it shuts down your ability to breathe. That's how you overdose. That's an overdose. You can't breathe. Your lips turn blue, and eventually your brain deprived of oxygen. Eventually, you die. And I'd also understood that there was, along with addiction, there was when you're in the throes of addiction, there was this intense, overwhelming feeling like you must have it now. You can't wait, and a whole lot more. But as I got into writing about the tuba in particular, but this is true, of course, of all wind instruments, but particularly the tuba,
Right.
I began to realize it was the opposite of addiction. What you're actually doing is cultivating and nourishing that precious column of air, that breath of life. So to the point where you can fill this enormous beast of an instrument, to the point where you can make these sounds that will rock your room. And it also seemed to me very, I'm a writer. I find metaphors in almost everything, right? So playing the tuba was very much like life itself. So how does it start? It starts by you blowing into this metallic mouthpiece, very saliva drenched. It sounds awful, right? It goes through the tubes, and then it begins this path, trajectory through these winding turns, these detours, these problems. You buffet it here and there, and make this turn, and then make that turn, and you come out the bell with this sound that will rock the bones of everybody in the room next to where you're sitting. And to me, that was very much like life. It's like it starts out, you're stumbling, you're buffeted, you're detours, you do this, and then finally you keep at it, and you learn to deal with all of those trips and stumbles and buffets and all that. And you come out with this gorgeous accomplishment. It doesn't have to be on the tuba, it can be almost anything in life, honestly. And to me, that was like a moment. I still remember, I think I was sitting up in my office, in my writing office, and I was like, oh man, that is something. That is absolutely true, and a good way of explaining. And so anyway, from there, it was like, again, the way we do best is when we immerse ourselves in something as human beings. And it doesn't matter, landscaping, carpentry, whatever. It doesn't matter. But when you immerse yourself in it, you get so immersed in it and really loving it, presumably, that you begin to get very good, and a lot of ideas begin to occur to you. And that's how the great inventions are made. I firmly believe. But it's that immersion that I have learned as a journalist is so important. Now, when you do it, all these ideas just begin to flood in, and you get high on that, honestly. I swear to God. Yeah. And so to me, this was kind of, I hope I'm answering your question, but I think this was kind of how I felt as I got into this book, that it was like almost like life itself. The tuba was almost like life itself, right? Yeah. You were cultivating this beautiful column of air to then fill this weird instrument with air consistent enough so that you can make these beautiful sounds, and these sounds that really just have this enormous event. And very, that's kind of what kids need to understand. Yeah. Life's going to buffet you. You're going to take all these detours and left turns and all that, and you're going to sound awful. And then you keep doing it. You keep doing whatever it is you're doing, and eventually you will get to a point where you sound profound.
So we have talked about this a bit, but just to kind of clarify also, after writing about addiction and social fragmentation, and you wrote a book about people dedicating themselves to mastering something that is difficult, simply for the love of it, right? So what did the world of band, and the tuba specifically, reveal to you about how people find purpose today?
Yeah, purpose is something I think that is lacking, and I think a lot. And I think people are looking for money. They're looking for the easy this or that, and purpose is I think so, because I have found it in my own life through my own journalism, and through a lot of hard work for years. I don't think of it as hard work. I loved it, but it was hard work, and you just get better and you get better and you get better, and it's a beautiful idea, and I love that. So it wasn't hard for me to see the parallels in band and the tuba. It was pretty easy after a while. And I think where I saw a lot of this was in, again, getting back to the Lopez High Band in Brownsville, Texas, and their one big concert in 2004 at the TMEA conference. These kids worked and worked and worked. It's hard for me to overstate how much these kids worked on this 6-piece concert. And what I remember, what I loved was I got a hold of the French horn leader of that band, a guy named Eddie Salinas, who's now a freelance musician in Corpus Christi, Texas. And I interviewed him. Now, I never met him, but I interviewed him over the phone a couple of times. Anyway, he said a week after that show, he saw George Trevino, his band instructor, on campus on the high school. And he comes up to me and goes, "Hey, yeah, Mr. Trevino, what's next?" And George Trevino goes, this is the end of the year. It was like March or April, winding down. He goes, "Well, no, that's it. There's nothing else. That's it. We're done." And Eddie Salinas told me, I was overcome. I was like, "No, they can't be. It can't be. We have to continue." Because he had gotten so used to the idea of practicing something until it was perfect. Now, other people would look at that and go, "These kids must hate this. They must be so bored or rebelling against the hard work." No. These kids loved it. And Eddie Salinas was one of those. And he was like, "I couldn't believe that we were done. I wanted to continue playing, 4 measures and making sure that those 4 measures for an entire class were going to be perfect by the time we ended the class," kind of thing. Got so used to that. And he says, it was a strange thing because all those Trevino and other Mr. Trevino and other band directors at Lopez at that time was preparing us to play a series of pieces, but let's just call Symphony Number 6 by Vincent Persichetti. Play this piece one time as perfectly as we could, and that was it. That's what we were after. And you would think that that's not much, or that you can't take much of that with you. But I'm here to tell you, he told me, I've taken all of that with me my entire life. It's all of this sticks with me. That what I learned there, just working endlessly over like a few measures at a time, I learned how to navigate life. You take that with you. It's not lost. It is actually ingrained in you. Even though you may not, and he's a musician in his case, but other people may not ever be a musician, you still learn this thing. It's the importance of doing things perfectly, or doing as perfectly as possible. That's better. Not perfectly, but as perfectly as you possibly can. And coming away with that experience is, I am afraid, in our culture today, stressing immediate gratification and protecting our precious kids from any kind of hard work whatsoever, any disappointment, any difficulties, that we are in a situation where kids are actually turned away from that, and that is not healthy. It's long term is essential for kids to learn that stuff, because that's how you navigate life well. But also, if you ask me, frequently it leads to drug addiction, because drugs are nothing if not all that, easy, immediate gratification. That's like the far end. That's the final expression of all those attitudes that parents seem to want to inculcate their kids with.
Yeah. Well, Sam, I'll tell you, this has been a wonderful conversation. I really enjoy reading this book, and I hope that everybody that's listening buys it immediately. I think they'll be inspired by it. I think in some ways it helped, it reinforced the work we do.
Yes,
because it is, sometimes you're right. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of time, but the commitment to these kids is so important. And the avenue of music, I'm glad I ran into the book. I'm glad I've had the opportunity to meet you now and to talk with you. We have a couple of questions we ask everybody at the end. Before we get to those, I want to just one final question. At the end of the book, you encourage people to find their own perfect tuba. I think it's the last line, if I remember.
Yes.
And for our listeners today, whether they're students or teachers, or it doesn't matter, someone that's searching for purpose, what would you leave our listener with, and how to find the perfect tuba?
Don't be afraid of the idea that you have to work hard at it first. That's first and foremost, and that nothing comes without that. And that even though all around you people may be saying, kick back, or it's 5 p.m. somewhere, you know, that kind of crap. I say keep at it. And understand too that you will not maybe at first find the love for it. It's passion. We all need to find our passion. Yes, it's how you find your passion is the thing. How you find your passion is by working hard at something, getting good at it, and then saying, "Oh, you know what? I can do this. I'm pretty good at this." All of a sudden, you know, that kind of thing. And to me, this is, and then once you find your purpose or a purpose in life, I think it will come from hard work. I think it will come from collaborating with others and learning from mentors, teachers, all that. Obviously, a lot of that is all part of the mix, and taking it small steps at a time, and not being disappointed or embarrassed by failure. Failure is part of it all. All of that, we've learned this. Human beings have learned this for eons. You know, in America, we seem to have wanted to forget that, and I'm afraid the kids are going to be overwhelmed with the idea that they can just kick back and not do much, and still get to some point where they're doing well. And I don't think so. You know, so that is kind of how I would express how you find purpose. And in fact, it's kind of like reflects how I've done what I've done with journalism. I just love journalism so much. It's so much fun, so interesting, so fascinating, and it took a ton of work to get where
I can imagine.
This has been such an incredible and insightful conversation, Sam. So here's the point of the podcast where we ask all of our guests 3 standing questions. Okay. And I'll take the first one. Do you have a soapbox topic? And it can be about anything.
I will tell you, when it comes to band, yes, I do.
Please.
Even though I never was in band. I would say, what the hell is up with those props? Get rid of, I mean, what does that have to do with the beauty, the thing that teaches, I'm getting a little flustered here. Props? You got to be kidding. What does that have to do with playing and marching together in unison and playing well together? What it shows, I'm going to tell you what it shows, in my view, very strongly. It shows which school district has a lot of money and which doesn't. You know what I mean? So I think I was sat there during a band finals 2023 looking at those props, and I'm like, looking around, does anybody else think this is absurd? You know, I know people want to, you know, at a certain point, you get to a point where all the bands sound so fantastic that it's very difficult to see which one is better than the other. So maybe the props are part of the mix. I understand that. And I love the idea that people want to do storytell and to have this beautiful presentation, all of that. But it seems to me like what you're saying is all those districts where the economic levels are poor or working class, they're going to have a tough time. Yeah. If you're judging them based on props, those schools will have a very tough time.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting, your response. There is a big divide, honestly, in music education of the have and the have nots. And a lot of it does have to do with the cost of running, you know, a major program for the sole purpose of being the most competitive you can be. And I don't want to go down that road because it's a whole nother podcast, but it is something that is real out there. And it's interesting to me that you're seeing it, like you've come into the band world and that's an observation that you make immediately. So a
fascinating one, by the way.
It really is.
Fascinating.
My question is simply, you're a writer, so this will be interesting as well. We usually ask, is there a book or books that have inspired your journey?
Well, there are many, 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 but I would say one of the books that about I have not read many books about writing. If you want to be a writer, you write. If you want to be a tuba player, you play the tuba. Okay. So reading about how a tuba player played, it can be helpful, but it's not going to get you to where you want to be. You got to play. And so writing is the same way. However, for books on writing, to me, that are the one that is really the most influential of all is a book called On Writing Well. by William Zinsser, who's now passed. But he wrote this book, and the first 8 chapters of which are pretty much the gospel on how to be a strong, particularly nonfiction writer, but really any kind of writer. And strangely enough, William Zinsser's ideas are not far from what we've been talking about. Writing is rewriting. You're not done when you do it the first time. It's working hard at mastering the basics. That's a big part of his thing. There's certain elements, I think, that are common to all human endeavors. And I just happen to write about tuba players and band directors. But I think the things that they are about are also similar in, molecular biology, and policing and setting up your own landscaping business. There's a lot of similarities that are required of someone, the hard work, perseverance, all that kind of stuff, and more that I think are important. And I think William Zinsser was my idol, my God. And I read his book. I have read his book, I think, 8 times or something like that in my life. And so for me, that was the most important book.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Sam, thank you. Now I'm going to ask the ultimate question.
I think I know what this one is.
As someone coming into the music world, we are curious about your answer. What is your favorite time signature?
I thought that was going to be it. Look, I grew up on punk rock. Okay. I grew up on nasty garage rock, and so and also a kind of great New Orleans music and boogie woogie and all that stuff. And so 4/4, I guess a common time. 4/4 is for me like I have based my entire musical life. Country music. I was very lucky to have grown up in a town called Claremont, California, which is a suburb of LA, but at the time had this enormous country music, hippie country music thing. And so I took lessons from guys who taught me the songs of Merle Haggard and Tammy Wynette and Emmylou Harris and all that. And it's all 4/4 time.
Yeah,
to me.
I love it.
I like other time signatures, but
well, it's clearly the right answer, so we appreciate it. So, Sam Quinones, the Perfect Tuba is the book. Again, thank you, Sam, for your time today. We really appreciate it. I think this is a conversation that I know our listeners are going to really enjoy. So, thank you.
I'd love to be in touch with all your listeners, and if any band directors adopt the book at any university, I do free kind of Zoom calls with book groups and that kind of thing.
Awesome.
This has just been wonderful. Thanks to you, John David, for having me on. I love it, and I have it's been a fantastic conversation. I'm so grateful.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap on today's episode. Thanks for spending part of your day with us on the Common Time Podcast. If today's conversation gave you something to think about or something to try with your students, we'd love for you to share this episode with a colleague.
And you can also follow us on social media for episode clips, behind-the-scenes content, and updates to our upcoming guests. And if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe so that you never miss an episode.
Until next time, keep making music and keep making a difference.